Some big names have decided whether they're heading to the NFL, staying in college, or entering the transfer portal to boost their draft stock. And to break down what it all means for the upcoming NFL draft, Benjamin Robinson from grindingthemocks.com is here with his second round of mock drafts. Benjamin, great to have you on as always. And before we dive into the biggest movers, I have to ask, now that college football season is over, how are you filling the void? What's keeping you sane during this time of year?
Um, this is the beginning of the race for me. It's exciting to kind of it's going to be hard to zoom out of the season because you're just thinking on a week to week basis. And now we kind of get to see the full picture of all the players. The All-Star games have begun with the Shrine Bowl and the Senior Bowl. And the Combine is in about a month. So things are really beginning to heat back up, but I love going from thinking about these teams, just thinking about these players in a deeper way. So it's an exciting time for me. But to me, it goes from the team stories, the rise of Indiana and the immaculate finish they had, to now focusing on those players that made those teams special. So to me, it's you're just trading one focus for another. We go from the macro to the micro, and then after the draft, we'll go back to the macro again.
It's so funny you bring that up because I was having lunch with a friend of mine earlier this week, and that's exactly what we were talking about is this notion that during the football season, there are so many plays, so many games, so many opportunities, so many players that you do lose a lot of the nuance and a lot of the granular details that you really need to have to do a proper evaluation. And now that the season is over, I at least find myself watching replayed games on like ACC Network and things like that, in the middle of the night, far more often than I did growing up, where I kind of needed that constant sensory overload. Now I'm like, no, I need to go back and, grind the film, so to speak, and really understand what just happened.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think it's really exciting. I think there's something to be said about having like the priors that we have after the season. And so it's always interesting to see where we are now and versus, where we are when we get closer to the draft, when we have a better idea of where these players are going and kind of think about like what's changed and then why is that changed? I think like a big example of that could be like a Ty Simpson, where the quarterback from Alabama, who was one of the players we talked about last time, who I said it would be really nice if he had a playoff run to showcase his talents, and has kind of been a little savior of the quarterback class by doing us the favor of not going to Miami and jumping into the draft. So there's all kinds of interesting players that it's kind of going to be like, hey, like what's going on with Trinidad Chambliss? That's I think even
Yeah.
a bigger question mark than Ty Simpson, who does Trinidad Chambliss, the quarterback from Ole Miss, does he even want to be in this class? Um, Sounds like he really wants to go back to Ole Miss, and he may not have a choice. But I'm not a lawyer, so
Right.
don't take my word for it.
Absolutely. We are not paid by the hour here on this program, no doubt.
No, I'll leave that to my
Uh,
girlfriend.
let's talk about quarterbacks here because I know you and I, even though we are on opposite ends of the country, we both gasped audibly. We could both hear each other's gasps when Dante Moore announced that he was returning to Oregon because the last time we talked, you had him projected as number 3 overall. So now that we've had some time to sort of process this shock and awe, talk us through the ripple effects of that decision. Who moves up? How does this reshape the top of the draft?
Yeah, I think, the real ripple effect is not as much on the rest of the class because if he was going to go in the draft, I think he would have gone number two. And so him going, not being in the class, does move like some people up. I think the big question will be whether or not there are one or two quarterbacks drafted in the first round. So I think this like level of uncertainty may have pushed Ty Simpson to be like, I can be the second quarterback. Why can't I be? People liked what I did in the first part of the season. So I think the big ripple effect is just wow, like this guy turned down being the number two overall pick in the draft. Uh, for the opportunity to be maybe the number one overall pick in the draft next year, or maybe to be the number two overall pick in the draft again. Um, I thought, at Over the Cap, they had a really great piece about like the financial piece of his decision to go or not, and said that, basically if you're going to be in the top 10 in a draft projected, you probably should go in, or even maybe the first half of the first round. So I think this decision is a very personal decision for Dante Moore, and so I don't deny him that opportunity. He thinks this is better for his development in the future. More power to him. I think he's kind of a risky prospect. Not as risky as like the Trey Lances of the world, like have been in the past, where he really doesn't have a track record. Dante Moore has a track record. It's just that I think he doesn't feel ready. And so if he doesn't feel ready, then I don't think he should go. But I think he's missing an opportunity. I think there's really only one way to go for the most part, and it's to fall. So it wouldn't surprise me if next year he's a first round pick, but a later first round pick. But if he's comfortable with that in terms of his potential development as an overall like player and person, then I think that's great. But yeah, I will say that Oregon is losing a ton of production along the offensive line. They had a really great offensive line this year. I don't think the offensive line will be as good next year as it was this year. So there'll be a little bit of a newness to navigate. The new offensive coordinator as well, with Will Stein leaving to go to Louisville. So it's a risky proposition, but I think he understands the risks and thinks that this is best for him as a person. So I'll never deny someone that, but I think if he's trying to maximize his earnings or maximize his draft position, then he should have gone in this year. But if he's thinking differently, then more power to him. He's thinking longer term than I am.
For sure. And it is fascinating when it comes to sort of the draft ripple effect, so to speak, because it is very difficult to project to 2027. I mean, just think about what we were trying to do at the start of this college football season when we were talking about the Garrett Nussmeyers of the world potentially going number one overall. And unfortunately for him, he had a brutal season. And so, what happens to him going forward, it's hard to say. But that's what makes this exercise just so difficult is you really have to think short term in terms of, okay, what do you want out of your football experience? Is it something where you feel like you can do even cooler things at Oregon because it is a super dynamic offense, regardless of who's around you? That's certainly a big question. Do you feel like that you can develop your skills so much to where it doesn't even matter who else is in the quarterback draft class? That's also a very interesting exercise, for him, and I think pretty much for the rest of us. And it leads me to my next question when it comes to Ty Simpson, the Alabama quarterback you were talking about earlier, because if he's going to be quarterback number two, you have him projected, I believe, 18th overall. Is he someone who, like, had Dante Moore declared that maybe he would have stayed another year with the Tide, and perhaps he should have done that, or perhaps he should have been in the transfer portal and gone to a Miami or something like that?
Yeah, I think I'd like to think he made his decision independent of that, but
Mhm.
I think it definitely increases his chances. There's going to be a lot of talking points about, which Ty Simpson are you getting? Are you getting that Ty Simpson that had a really nice stretch of the year for Alabama? I think you're also going to hear a lot about how the Alabama team kind of let him down in terms of the lack of a run game, the lack of like offensive line protection. Like the offensive line that you saw this year is not the traditional Tide offensive line that will have multiple players drafted in the first 100 picks. You might get one with a Caden Proctor. Um, so there'll be a lot of like trying to contextualize his his play. Um, but yeah, for me, I think at the end of the day, he probably made the right choice. He's a bit overage, and I think that's something else that I'll be following a lot. I'm still of the belief that age matters for prospects. Um, he stayed at Alabama for a long time, and so there's maybe isn't a desire that he doesn't want to play anywhere else, but that his best opportunity was to test the NFL waters and kind of get your pro career started. I think he'll probably be like 25 next year, 24 or something like that. So there'll be a lot of conversations about age, I think, especially with like this being kind of the last gasp of like players who even played at all during the pandemic. Um, so that's like an interesting factor to follow. Like, does age matter at quarterback? Does it matter at edge rusher, where Akeem Mesidor from Miami is going to turn 25 by the time he takes an NFL field? Um, these are like very interesting questions to me. I think smart analytical teams should weigh that in their decision-making process, but doesn't mean that there isn't one team that doesn't care about how old you are as a quarterback because their window for keeping their job is short and they don't care as much about long-term investment in the team or whatnot. They're just concerned about what can we do right now. And that's that like classic principal agent problem
Hmm.
in the NFL.
Absolutely. Yes. Job security is a wonderful thing that has to be factored into any and all of
Hell of
these
a drug, yeah.
decisions. Isn't that a tale as old as time as far as our work is concerned? Let's move
Amen.
on now to Miami edge rusher Ruben Bain. Absolutely dominated during his playoff run, obliterated some truly elite offenses from this past season. How much did that stretch help his draft stock in your eyes?
In my eyes, it helped his drag stock a bit. The only thing about that is that this is a relative game. And while Ruben Bain's draft stock is going up, Texas Tech edge rusher David Bailey's stock is going up even faster. So Bain definitely acquitted himself really well in the playoff. I think he's an awesome player. I think that he's going to be one of the players that gets picked apart the most because of his like physical measurables. Um, and I think that it'll be a real test of the tape versus the traits for him, where his tape is really good, his traits are not as good to some. I think he's personally worth a top five, top 10 selection. The question is, does he get pushed down a little bit? But the playoffs were very good for him. I think the problem that you end up with is that his tape was already good. So, like, what do you prove by being good? That you were good. And the questions about those physical measurables and stuff still remain. But I personally trust the tape that he's worth the top 10 pick. But then you're also hearing from reputable sources that some teams have round two grades on him for some reason. And so that's really confusing. And so that kind of like cognitive dissonance makes you question like, are we rating him too high? Or is that just a minority opinion? And like any other year, you just never hear the fact that some teams have, lower grades on players until they start to perform poorly, and then that information starts to come out that like, oh yeah, some teams didn't have a high grade on him. So, but yeah, I'm a big believer in Ruben Bain, and I'm hope to be proven right in that regard.
Who else made significant moves in this latest mock, positively and or negatively?
So yeah, the what I did in the update today on grindingthemox.com was talk about the kind of top five and fallers and risers in my most recent update. And so I include the top 50 so that you just get a little bit more of like those potential players that are considered like first round options. The biggest risers are three players that I've already mentioned. So one is Trinidad Chambliss, the cornerback from Ole Miss. People really liked what he did in the college football playoff. They really almost made the finals. Really incredible run. Um, he really picked up. I think a lot of people weren't even considering him as a prospect until recently, and then kind of thought he was going back to school. And now they're like, well, actually, he might have to come out. And so he's been a huge riser into the top 50. I don't think many people are actually talking about him as a first rounder, but I think his stock is being pushed up by the lack of options, high end options at cornerback, and people kind of liked him a lot in the playoffs. But I wasn't hearing a ton about him until December. So basically until right around when the playoffs began. So he's the biggest riser for sure, but I think it'll either fall off or legal options will open for him and he'll be able to return to Ole Miss where he wants to go. The other players, David Bailey, edge rusher from Texas Tech. I think people really like his pass rush skill set. The Texas Tech defensive line is going to have like three guys drafted in the top 50, um, or even, yeah, probably the top 50, with Lee Hunter, the defensive tackle, and Romello Height, the other edge rusher. So he's excellent. I think he could end up as edge one if the rumors about the kind of lack of like true consensus on Ruben Bain are true. The third is Akeem Mesidor, the edge rusher from Miami, who also, along with Bain, had a really great college football playoff run. Like I mentioned, he has these age concerns, but he has less of these physicality concerns. He also, I think, has some injury concerns. So he just entered into my end of the first round. So those are the three of the like top five players. Other players who are in those like faller camp. Um, this is the thing that I'll say in terms of caveats. This is all relative. So a some of these players might be falling two picks, but if they're falling from pick five to pick seven, I consider that a lot versus falling from pick 30 to pick 32. And so my number one faller right now is Jordan Tyson, the wide receiver from Arizona State. Um, the draft is like kind of a zero-sum game in terms of like there as people rise, others will fall. And so a player who's risen a lot lately is Makai Lemon, the wide receiver from USC. Fight on, go Trojans. And Tyson, I think people are kind of looking at him and saying we like the prospect, but there's some injury concerns and it might cause him to fall. So he's kind of in the beginning stages of like leveling out his stock, and we'll see what happens after the combine. The other two players, Caleb Downs from Ohio State, always been like a top 10 player in my rankings. I think some people are beginning to see that his the ceiling outcome in the draft might be at the end of the top 10 instead of in the beginning of the top 10. Um, Safeties tend to fall a bit, even the really good ones like Derwin James and Kyle Hamilton kind of went like a little bit later than you thought they would in the draft. And I think there'll be a lot of discussion around him as the draft process continues. And the other I have is Keldrick Falk, edge rusher from Auburn, who's kind of come back to where he was at the beginning of the process preseason, which is intriguing edge rusher, but um, unclear what whether he's going to actually live up to that because he didn't have as good of a season in 2025 than he did in 2024 when people were really excited about him.
Mhm. I want to dig into your process here. And by the way, if you're not already subscribing to Grinding the Mocks on Substack, go ahead and pause this video right now and go do that. And we will wait patiently right here until you return, and then we can proceed. Okay, good. Uh, so, Benjamin, you mentioned there's a time component to these projections. The further out we are, the less accurate we tend to be, and we understand that. At what point in the calendar year do you feel like that we kind of hit that critical threshold where the variance really starts to narrow and your projections get more locked in?
Um, I haven't looked at this in a little bit. Um, that's why I tend to update my data at like kind of key milestones. Um, One day I'll put up some charts that kind of like outline kind of when you're at this point in the process, this is kind of what the data tells us about, how many players we have projected in round one that actually end up in round one. In the summer, it tends to be like a little more, hey, like these are players to look at. Like these players are likely to be top 100 picks. After the season, I feel like these players are likely to be, in our top two rounds. When we get to the combine, it's kind of like we're still doing some shuffling. Post combine, there's going to be a lot of craziness because people are seeing things at the combine that sometimes don't jive or they get excited more about players that have specific traits that get highlighted at the combine. And then we kind of come back to earth before the draft. So I'd say the time to really start saying, like, hey, this is how I feel really strongly about my predictions are starting in like the final stretch. So right after like kind of pro days are ending in April, as the like draft is kind of coming into its final stretch. Those are when like my predictions are the best. And obviously, like right before the draft, my predictions are the best. When I measure like mock draft quality, I'll look at mock drafts across the entire season, and they're pretty much always the best, like the last day or two before. So those are when I have the best quality predictions. Those are when the best mock drafters are making their final predictions, but those also tend to be the strongest. It's very rare that someone makes a mock draft that's really good and then like a week before the draft. Though it did happen in that I think it was in the 2022 or no 2023 NFL draft with the Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, where the best mock draft I had was from like the week before the draft, which was like the people were like, "What's going on with CJ Stroud? Is he falling? Is Anthony Richardson falling?" And it turns out they all went in the top five. So there was a lot of like overthinking a week out from the draft. And so in that draft, like the best predictions I had were in some ways from like a week before. But I'll, for the most part, continue to see that the best mock drafts in terms of quality are coming up in like the last couple days before the draft. But I also love the journey of this process. And so to me,
Sure.
I'm always looking to see what's happening at any one moment. And I'm updating my numbers internally, but I don't publish them because I think there's just a lot of minute changes that can happen that really don't actually signal something new. It's just noise. And so you want to capture those data points at meaningful times. So that's why my first release this year was after the season. And then my second release was kind of after the declare date because there are meaningful uh, decisions for players to go into transfer portal or go back to school.
For sure. And I remember that one particularly because there was a lot of gamesmanship when it came to, okay, who's available, someone's going to get picked earlier, all of that thing, all of that stuff. I think the Baker Mayfield year was probably another one where all
Yeah.
different kinds of ideas were being bandied about. And it does feel like that when it comes to quarterbacks, where the stakes are much higher than, say, other years where it's a lighter quarterback draft, that's the time. And maybe I'm just, dealing with small sample size here, but it certainly seems like that when you have those valuable positions and you're chock full of them, that's the time when people start to throw out all kinds of crazy ideas. And then it is up to us to make sure that we can corral them and make sure that we're the adults in the room, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we want to be making adjustments to the data that we see, and that's one of the things that I just published on my site these weighted mock draft shares that I put out. And basically, that's a way of saying, hey, not every mock draft is created equal, and we can adjust them to account for specific things we care about, and those things that we can talk about a little bit more later. Specifically, are when the mock draft was created and who created it, and that gives us a kind of more nuanced picture of you know which teams are looking at specific positions or specific players, and then for the players, what teams are looking at them, just to kind of give you a little more evidence to some of the takes that you see out there of, oh yeah, like this team is interested in this position. Yeah, they put up, there's a couple of mocks out there that tell this different story, but when we weight these things appropriately, you know, there's not as much information out there as you might think currently based on how I weight things. So I'm happy to chat about that a little more.
For sure. And that's the tricky part here is, you're dealing with, who does it best and when do they do it best? Because, everyone has or not everyone, but a lot of people, you'll have good years and bad years and things like that. And, when these things are done also, can matter a great deal. And also too, I think the fact that you've also added team charts to grindingthemocks.com is also a fantastic way to kind of see, okay, as these things continue to come together, how are we refining them specifically for teams that may have an absolute obvious need in one position versus those who are always doing best available and all of that good stuff. And so I'm curious when it comes to team specific ideas and how that can impact what we're seeing at this stage of the game.
So I think one of the things that's the most meaningful right now is the draft order coming into focus. Um, so, for example, there are teams that, the Jets, for example, you'll get a lot of quarterback knocks for them when people thought they would be number one. Now they're number two, and, they're not getting a quarterback most likely, at least at that number two pick. And so as that comes in more into focus, that changes like some of the meaning that we have to the data that we're taking in. It's important to say like, hey, I don't want to just look at like raw mocks because maybe at the end of the cycle there have been so many quarterback mocks to the Jets it overinflates some things. So at this point in the draft, we're a little bit less than 100 days out from the draft. So to me, that means that I'm weighting the mock drafts that are coming out around now about a little bit higher than point 0.1 on a scale of 0 to 1. And so we're not actually weighting these mock drafts very highly, but when we aggregate them, we can start to see patterns. And so to me, right now, one of the things that I put on the site includes the weighted ADP as well. So the average draft position weighted by those factors as well. So you can see like, oh, like if we look at the Jets chart, yeah, quarterback is high, but the ADP for them, like it looks a little different because we know that the Jets aren't picking at uh, you know, 8 or 9 anymore. They're picking at, 2. And so as like the data comes in and as things kind of coalesce, you'll start to see those things kind of come into focus better. But the draft order really helps solidify things just because we know that based on the strengths of the class, um, that those positions will be more or less available in different parts of the draft. So, but yeah, the draft order coming into focus helps a lot. Free agency changes that and provides deeper information as well. Whatever trades that will happen, any types of like injury or other types of news will come in, but it's always cool to look back at like previous year's data and see like how much were our priors on that stuff right, or did the draft just not fall that way, and things would have been different if otherwise.
For sure. Always recap the journey and see where you were versus where you are and see if anything
Yeah.
wacky happened. And then you can evaluate why that's the case and, see if something happens for it. Let's talk about a few teams here. Maybe do this in a little lightning round mode because there are four teams that currently have two first round picks. And I'd like to get your insights as far as what to expect from them, at least at this stage of the game. And let's talk about the Jets because they have picks number 2 and number 16. And given how they performed this past season, or really this season, they've got a lot of work to do. And so, what do you see New York doing there?
I think people are, the mock draft community is coalescing around Arvell Reese, the linebacker from Ohio State, we talked about last time, who I think by the time that everything's over will definitely be a top 5 pick. Was one of our biggest risers coming into the first release. If we look from like earlier in the season, I think he'll still be one of the top risers from like the very beginning of the draft process this year. So he's definitely making a case for himself to be that second overall pick. I still find it hard to believe that an off-ball linebacker would make that kind of maybe be that kind of selection. But if they truly do plan to play him as an edge rusher here and not just the kind of Jalen Walker hype of he played linebacker, but we think he can pass rush, like this whole Micah Parsons hype up. We'll see. I'd like to believe that they would draft a player who can be really useful to them. So if they're drafting him that high, I would hope that he would be an edge rusher first and a linebacker second. But it seems like a lot of people think they just don't know that he might be a linebacker who can just rush the passer. But there's a lot of people who think he's really special. So he's a guy who I think people are coalescing around as their top overall selection. And then after that, I think there's a fair amount of interest in a number of positions. Largely, you're going to hear about quarterback because it's still an issue. And, Ty Simpson is out there and he has a decent chance of being available at that second pick. So the question is, how highly did they rate him? Or do they plan to kind of take another guy later in the draft? Or did they make a go at Malik Willis, for example, in free agency? Um, but yeah, outside of quarterback, I'd say wide receiver and cornerback are the positions to watch. Makai Lemon from USC, who I mentioned before, is a riser and has been pegged to them a bit, but he might be playing himself out of that position with how well his process has gone. But wide receiver still an option, cornerback still an option. But yeah, I think to me it wouldn't surprise me if they went Arvell Reese and then some wide receiver at that second pick to kind of help with that offense for whoever they get at quarterback. Maybe if free agency will tell us more about that.
Now that the Browns have a head coach, what do you see them doing at picks number 6 and number 24?
The runaway right now is offensive tackle and wide receiver. So the offensive tackles that I think that they would consider at their first round pick are Utah's Spencer Fano and Miami's Francis Mauigoa. Or I'm sometimes hearing Maui Noah. I must not be able to pronounce his last name correct. I'll learn to do that correctly by the time the draft comes. Um, and so, if they decide to go offensive tackle, those seem to be the guys that they would pick first. The name that's being pegged, if they decide to go wide receiver first, at that would be so if they decide to go wide receiver with that first pick, Jordan Tyson, who I mentioned from Arizona State, seems like an option, and Carnell Tate from Ohio State seemed like an option. So seems like they probably are going to go somewhere on offense, both on the offensive line and wide receiver. If they go wide receiver first, offensive tackle second, I think you're seeing more like Caleb Lomu, the other tackle from Utah, being a part of that consideration. But yeah, I think it's this offensive tackle selection is kind of atonement that they are making for not drafting Armand Membu last year when they had the opportunity, and they drafted Mason Graham instead, that defensive tackle, and had a great defense. And look where they are now. They are really in need of offensive line help, and that is a huge weakness for the Browns. Is are old at the offensive line, and there's a lot of attrition that could happen. So they who knows, they might double up at offensive line. It wouldn't totally surprise me. But wide receiver and offensive tackle are those positions.
The Dallas Cowboys have the bravado that they can find another Micah Parsons. They have picks 12 and 20 because of that trade. What do you see them doing?
So yeah, I mean, I was totally surprised when the DVOA numbers for like worst defense in like DVOA history came up, and the Cowboys were near the top. So wasn't surprised to see
Hmm.
a lot of personnel change on that side of the ball,
Hmm.
with Eberflus out and now Christian Parker in. There's a lot of talk about them just doubling up at defense here. So that's something. So to me, the positions that you're seeing on defense right now, edge rusher, linebacker, and cornerback. So the top option for a linebacker, outside of Arvell Reese, who, like I said, will be a top five pick, is his teammate at Ohio State, Sonny Styles. So that's a player I think a lot of people will point out. I think the linebacker play was so bad that I think people were kind of hungry for somebody who can come in, and there have been a lot of Fred Warner comparisons for him. For edge rusher, I brought up Keldrick Falk. I think that's a player who's been tabbed to them a bit. David Bailey, I think, is also kind of going to be potentially going earlier than where they're picking. And then for cornerback, Avion Terrell, um, who's his older brother, is with the Falcons. So good family, good player, good school. The player that I think a lot of people are going to continue to mock to them potentially is Jeremiah Love as well, the
Just
running
about to
back from
say
Notre
that.
Dame.
Yeah.
And so that's something that, I think potentially he'll go earlier than their pick. I think like the Saints are a decent bet right now for them to target him, just because he's going to be a top player on people's boards. And if you're a top player on the board, they don't care as much about your position. We've seen that over the recent past. So I think like to think that the Cowboys have learned their lesson on running back, but time will tell.
Despite all of the needs that they have defensively, I would not be surprised if they go in that direction. And so, if the odds makers give me something juicy, then I might very well bet on that. We will see how things shape up between now and then.
No comment.
Yeah, exactly. How about the Rams? Picks 13 and 29.
Yeah, I think a lot depends on the Matt Stafford, future there. I mean, you'd think that he would be somebody who would be, just having like an MVP caliber season. He's not in the Super Bowl, unfortunately. Um, but you think he'll be back. So I think, they're going to use this opportunity to pick in the top 10. Unfortunately, there's no quarterback I think that's really worth taking there. If he did retire, I think it'd be really interesting to see kind of what they would do. Um, so you'll see Ty Simpson tagged to them still, just because I think people are saying like, hey, like at some point you do need to kind of pull the trigger on a future successor for him. But I think for the most part, people are looking at cornerback and tackle. So You're going to hear a lot of debate about the top two corners in this class, where they go and when they go. And those cornerbacks are Jermod McCoy from Tennessee and Mansour Delane from LSU. So I think there's a lot of those guys. Hey, like, their pass defense, you know, the defensive backs just were not as good as they have been. And so I think there's an argument that they need to invest some amount of draft capital there. And then you can never have enough guys on the offensive line. And so Caleb Lumu is somebody that's under discussion for them too. But the question ends up being, if a lot of people are saying Caleb Lumu is a good pick where he is, then he might be on the way up, or at least a consideration for a lot of teams. But that trade with the Falcons just looking better and better every day this season. It was always going to be something, like this. And then it turns out that it's become this top first half of the draft pick. So worked out really well for them. But yeah, I would expect cornerback to be a big consideration, an offensive tackle, if it's not quarterback.
There's just certain NFL franchises you don't want to throw bones to, and the LA Rams just happens to be one of them. And now look at what's happened. They made the NFC
Yeah.
Championship game, and if Matt Stafford comes back, if they're not the favorite to win the NFC West, if not the NFC, they're certainly going to be high up as far as we're all concerned. And so, yeah, I'm with you. Like that will be
Yeah.
as fascinating as any team selection, as far as I know, because of what they can do, their capabilities, the player development, all that good stuff. As
Yeah.
far as looking into
I'm kind of
February,
wondering,
no, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering if, like, do you think they're more like the Astros or more like the Rays? Yeah, I personally don't want to trade with them either.
hmm
So
Yeah, I mean, I would put them in the Astros category. I
without the
think it's
cheating.
something where they're constantly there. They have proven they can win a championship, unlike the Rays.
Yeah.
And it's just something where, like, it's also possible that they might have their whole coaching staff back. They're not going to lose anyone as well. And I also think that it's not just players, but coaches as well. If there is that cohesion, then you don't have to worry about communication barriers or anything like that. Everybody can finish each other's sentences. Just another reason. And this isn't just me being based in LA here. This is me genuinely believing that it would not have taken much for them to have won another Super Bowl this year. And so why
Yeah.
can't they run it back?
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah. They're really sharp. And having those two first, I wouldn't be surprised if they flipped them again,
Mhm.
in some way.
Absolutely. So as we head into February and eventually Combine Pro Days, what should we be looking for right now?
Oh man. Um, so I think the types of like overreacting around specific drills like the 40, um, you're going to see a lot of talk about players like Brennan Thompson, the wide receiver from Mississippi State, who I think a lot of people are saying is going to run in the 4.2s at the combine. It's being fast is a good skill, and it definitely can help your draft position. Teams do care about that, but at the same time, he wasn't thought of as a very good prospect outside of that skill. So I think the main thing is, if you see players who have outlier traits, the question is, like, if you watched it on the film, was that trait showing, or are they just a workout warrior? And so there's all kinds of examples of players who have that kind of process, and then they end up not getting drafted as high, and they kind of get that like reversion to where they were scouted at before the combine. Like, it's good to know. But yeah, to me, I say don't get too lost in the sauce of some of these late breaking things. Most of the teams have already kind of graded these players, how they've evaluated them in terms of the scouting process. And everything here is kind of a little bit more marginal in terms of, we have this base grade and then we adjust based on like age or analytical factors and other things. But you still need to have that very good base scouting evaluation of the players, and that has already happened. Or if it isn't, that's wrapping up now with the All-Star games being over, and everything else is a little more marginal on top. But the predictions we get are better as we get closer, because just the information environment is better. Even if the evaluation of the players is the same, ours as the public is evolving, even if the teams aren't as much.
Good deal. Benjamin Robinson from Grinding the Mocks. One more time, tell everyone where they can find your work and follow along with your draft coverage.
Appreciate it. Yeah, grindingthemox.substack.com, grindingthemox.com. You can find me on the X Twitter machine at grindingmox. Yeah, we just put out newly designed site today with some of those new features, including the premiere of our new Chief Feline Officer position. So excited for folks to experience that. But yeah, I'll be off to the combine next month in Indianapolis for most of the week. I'll usually leave right before the actual events and drills start to happen. But it's the real first opportunity to start reconnecting with the team clients that I have, and it's always a good time. So this is the beginning of the race for me.
And I know you are going to be welcoming of anyone who wants to say hello to you and
Oh
get a
yeah.
selfie with you out at the combine in Indianapolis, especially with the new swag that you're wearing. That looks
Yeah.
fantastic. Very dapper.
Yeah, definitely need to pull these out for sure. So it'll be a good time. And yeah, I always love connecting with folks.
Benjamin Robinson, thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Edward.